Yaate, Sheikh Edo Shidane, Sheikh Vincent Redhouse in Nisha. Irish, Nishali, Filipino, Bashashin, German Dashishe, Aro Kilchini Dashanali. Akotego, Dine Nishali. Ahiyehe. As a Navajo man, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and their elders, past, present, and future. Tonight I'm going to talk about self-determination. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal experiences with it, and a little bit about the experiences of Native Americans in general. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about self-determination in Australia. So about me. I grew up, like a lot of Native Americans, very poor. I grew up in a neighborhood and in a family that had issues with drugs and alcohol. Growing up, education was not very important to me. I was the youngest of 4 siblings, and I was the first to complete high school on time. However, that came with a caveat. When I graduated high school, I graduated with the most unexcused absences of anyone to ever graduate from that school. It's been around since the 1960s. As a teenager and a young adult, I had my own issues with drugs and alcohol, being arrested for both. And as a young adult, I also found myself homeless for a brief period of time. With the help of some truly amazing friends, I was able to get my life back on track, to find work, to create some stability. And after a while, what I realized is that I wanted to give back. I wanted to provide opportunities for people who grew up like me. And if I could, I wanted to help future generations so that they didn't have to grow up like me. Now, in order to achieve those goals, I figured I should probably get an education. Now, getting an education in the United States is not the cheapest thing, and as you can imagine, I'm not the wealthiest guy around. But nonetheless, I was able to get an education. And I was able to do that because my tribe, the Navajo Nation, was able to provide me with scholarships to pay for my tuition. And even more, when I arrived at the university campus as a first-generation college student, I found there was a resource center there just for Native American students, ran by Native Americans. This resource center gave me a place where I could feel at home, a place where I could be myself, a place where I could get support. Now, that center was not there simply out of the decency of my university. It was there because my tribe, as well as other tribes across the country, have donated millions of dollars to universities to get them to build these centers, to support us, to provide their children, their future generations, with opportunities to succeed. My tribe would not have been in that position had it not been for the United States Congress passing the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act in 1975. Now, in 1970, President Richard M. Nixon delivered a message to the U.S. Congress on Indian affairs. Since assuming his presidency, Nixon had been meeting with tribal leaders from all over the country. He wanted to understand what was happening to Native Americans, what was happening on these reservations. In the previous decades, U.S. policy for Indians had been mostly paternalistic. The federal government had assumed almost near complete control of all the affairs happening on reservations. And what Nixon noticed is that this wasn't working. Outcomes for Native Americans were either remaining stagnant or getting worse. In his message, Nixon identified 3 areas in particular that needed to be addressed: economic outcomes, health outcomes, and education outcomes. In terms of economics, the average unemployment rate for Native Americans in 1970, he said, was 10 times higher than the national average, with some reservations experiencing unemployment of up to 80%. The average life expectancy for Native Americans, he said, was 44 years old. Infant mortality rates were 50% higher than the rest of the population, and suicide rates were nearly double the rest of the population. The average education level for Native Americans was year 6. In order to address those poor outcomes, Nixon, working together closely with tribal leaders, developed a policy of self-determination. They wanted to shift away from the paternalistic policies the government had towards tribal self-determination. In his proposal, Nixon listed 5 key elements to achieving self-determination for tribes. First, the federal government needed to provide training and support so that tribes could learn how to take advantage of self-determination, could learn how to administer their own programs and govern themselves. Second, special subcommittees and councils should be created by Native Americans and for Native Americans to assist the United States Congress in creating federal Indian policies. Third, that none of that should be taken as diminishing or mitigating the special relationship between the United States and its tribes, a nation-to-nation relationship. Fourth, that this needed to become the norm. We could not simply have self-determination as an experiment, 5, 10, 15 years, but it needed to be the thing that was done, now and always. And lastly, he told Congress that they needed to raise the budget on Indian affairs so that self-determination could actually take hold. And 5 years later, 1975, the United States Congress took those words and turned them into action, for the most part. They passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, and that realized 4 of the elements Nixon was talking about. Where it failed was it didn't provide additional funding for tribes. And in fact, over the next 10 years, funding for tribes was reduced by over half and has continued to fall to this day, to the point in which Native Americans per capita receive less federal funding than any other group in the United States. Despite the lack of funding, however, tribes, beginning primarily in the 1990s, started enrolling in self-determination programs. And today, over half of the 567 federally recognized tribes from Arizona, where I'm from, all the way up to Alaska, are able to exercise some form of self-determination. So what have the results been? Well, obviously they've been good, or else I wouldn't be up here. Unemployment for Native Americans on reservations is just above 11%. Average life expectancy for Native Americans whose primary health care comes from their tribe is 73 years. Infant mortality rates and suicide rates have decreased dramatically and have also decreased relative to the rest of the population. And over 80% of Native Americans under the age of 25 have high school diplomas or equivalent, and over 30% have college degrees like myself. Now, it took a long time for these results to come about, almost 20 years until you started seeing them pop up. Much of that had to do with the fact that the government did not properly fund self-determination. Much of it also had to do with the situation the indigenous people were in at the time. It's not easy to dig yourself out of a hole like that. Much of it likely also had to do with the attitudes of American citizens, who by and large have often viewed Native Americans as being savage, antiquated, unfit to govern. But despite all of those obstacles, self-determination has been a success. Things are not perfect in the United States. The numbers are still unacceptable, but self-determination has worked, and it continues to work to this day. So why hasn't it worked here in Australia? When I present those results to Australians, the reply I usually get is something like, "Mate, listen, we tried that. It failed." And I think, really? You guys really tried that? And I looked at it. And sure enough, in the 1960s, beginning then, Australia started to talk about self-determination. You had voting in 1962 for Indigenous Australians, the census in 67, and so on and so forth. Some really great things happened here. But none of those things were self-determination as I've described it. They were positive steps. They weren't self-determination. The closest, perhaps, that Australia has come to self-determination was ATSIC, the Australian Torres Strait Islander Commission. Now, from anyone's perspective, ATSIC was not perfect. It was a bit of a mess. Nonetheless, it was a step in the right direction towards self-determination. Unfortunately, after only lasting roughly 10 years, it was abolished. And when it was abolished, the Australian government claimed that self-determination as an experiment had failed. And since then, Australia's policies towards its Indigenous people have primarily been paternalistic. Now, I shared my story with you and the story of self-determination in the U.S. because I wanted you to see the success that can happen when you really give self-determination a chance, when you give it, as Australians would say, a fair go. You haven't done that yet. Now, I do believe that it can work here. I know Australia and America, they're not the same places, obviously. But there's no reason to think that your Indigenous people can't govern themselves. And you've heard the success now of what happens in the U.S. despite the beliefs that people have, despite the conditions that tribes are in, it can work. And if you listen to what your Indigenous people are saying, if you work with them, and you give them the time, you give them the space, you give them the resources, they will create that transformation. They will create success.